The debate that preceded the vote of no confidence into the Chief Minister raised a number of interesting points about the importance of the role. Some MHKs suggested that the policies of government would not change regardless of the person leading the Council of Ministers. Others felt that a change of Chief Minister was needed, but seemed somewhat vague on why and indeed what a replacement might do differently. On agenda this week, former Douglas East MHK Chris Robertshaw considers the debate and explains what they should be talking about. You were in for the debate, the no confidence debate in relation to the Chief Minister. I suppose to start with, what did you make of the debate?
Oh gosh, that's an interesting question. In summary, you were left with the question, why are we here? I think that's a fair comment, because we weren't talking about big, overarching, serious and important policy issues. It was more or less a catharsis for some individual members to express their irritation. But coming back to the point, if that's what it ended up being, which was just individual expressions, then where on earth are we going to deal with the big issues? Because if you step back from the actual vote itself, sort of why did it occur? Well, it occurred, I think, because the issues surrounding Manx Care, as it were, brought it to a head. But what's Manx Care about, and what's the whole budget process about? Let's be honest, this problem started with the subprime crisis in America in 2008, and you and I were together trying to deal with the shock of the loss of 200 million. We got some of the way, you'll remember, but we certainly didn't get all of the way, and we're still struggling now. And it was as if somehow that was the conversation you couldn't talk about. So you're left with the choice of, do we carry on worrying about issues of individual members, however legitimate their interests may be down a particular rabbit hole? How do we get to the point that the House, the Council of Ministers and the people of the Isle of Man have an understanding about where we're going and why? And how do we achieve that, Phil?
And I forget now who it was, but somebody suggested that this was a great debate for political nerds. And, you know, I'll accept that I'm a political nerd. I suspect you might accept that title as well. But, you know, basically the charge was a great debate for political nerds, but where does this get us? And from the political nerd, the political commentator perspective, where it got me was thinking... members were almost openly admitting that it didn't really matter who the Chief Minister was, because effectively the system is developed through the collaborative will of the House of Keys as elected back in 2021, and it didn't really matter who was in charge, because it was the policies would stay pretty much the same. That seemed to be the message that was coming out. And if that was the case, then you start wondering what the point of having an election is.
Well, the issue of what are elections about in our system, they're about individual constituencies electing the most appropriate person, or persons now, of course, for them. But in what way does that relate to the big issues? And of course the big issue for us is being able to balance our budget and still deliver first-class services to the people of the Isle of Man. That was sort of removed, wasn't it, from the vote of no confidence, and the individual members seemed, as it were, willing to be, perhaps understandably, preoccupied with their own specific interests and willing to go down those particular rabbit holes. But the question lingers heavily in the air: how on earth do we now deal with the massive issue of how we balance our books? And of course this matter's really been in front of us since the subprime crisis in America in 2008, and you and I were together in the administration that had to face up to the fact that there was this £200 million loss of VAT, and yeah, we did our best. We cut back a significant amount of it. I remember very well becoming very unpopular in the process of having to do that. But I think it's important to focus on the fact that the Isle of Man is not a Me Too UK. The UK has its own currency. It can print money and has done remorselessly. It can carry significant debt. And we can't do that. And it's as if that whole issue is absent from what's actually happening in the House of Keys. And you're left with the question, how do we bring that big issue into focus, and how do we make it relevant, coming back to your point, at the point of election? And it's a bit of a torture, that one, but we have to deal with it.
And of course, I mean, you'll know from your experience, and certainly I've had probably slightly more experience of elections, and the issues that people get elected on are rarely the issues that are the dramatic, difficult issues that we're facing. I mean, you famously were very explicit in addressing the core issues, but very few people at election time actually get elected based on what are they going to do to activate the Manx economy to create more income for government, and what are they going to do to radically reduce the costs of government. Those things just don't appear on candidates' lips, because they probably can guess what would end up happening to them if they did.
Well, yes, quite. I mean, in the final time I was elected, I produced a little green book of government reform, actually thinking, no, having done that, there's no chance that I would get in. But actually I did. So I wonder whether there is some hope there, sort of somewhere. I hope to goodness there is. I mean, come back to the current issue of Manx Cares overshoot. I mean, I think everybody understands how huge it was. There was a massive application of additional funds, 40 million quid, and yet they're still overshooting. No wonder, as it were, that matter gets called in no uncertain terms. But the point I've been trying to make is that this is now starting to force us to address the issues we don't really want to address. And people have got to accept the fact that something's got to give somewhere. And that give, in my opinion, and I go back to an argument I've been putting forward now since 2014, is that government has to become a much more efficient organisation, and it needs redefining. And that's very unpopular. It's certainly unpopular with politicians, and it's definitely unpopular with civil servants. So how do we, if it is true that that's necessary, and I passionately believe it is, how on earth do we get there other than having that debate in a highly focused way? But remember that extra 10% income tax was a temporary thing, which is now converting into not temporary, and doesn't yet pay for what's coming down the track because of these big issues like demographic changes and extra cost of health. And goodness me, I could go on. I remember when we were together in the Council of Ministers, we were struggling with the fact that the public sector pension fund was running out. All these tremendous challenges are sort of in our faces, and we have to be able to deal with them. And that's very much removed from, well, who do I want for my personal representation in the House of Keys? Who do I think is the right person? So there's the gap.
Is it? I mean,
there's the gap.
It almost feels like we desperately need a shift in mindset amongst politicians. In that, possibly one of the reasons why people have become increasingly critical of government is still trying to retain all the functions it had before, with a much reduced workforce, and in places anyway, certainly in a number of the administrative roles, there have been significant reductions. So they're still expected to deliver the same sort of service, and they quite frankly can't do it because they've got substantially fewer staff members trying to deliver this, and sooner or later somebody in government's going to have to wake up to the fact that maybe we're going to have to rationalise the services that we're delivering.
Well, you say reduced persons. I assume you mean here on the front line, which I agree with, but the reality is that the size of government as a whole has continued to grow, and that was what I was...
And I suppose it depends on your department, doesn't it? I mean, education possibly, had a few restrictions, but not massive. Health, again, seems to be getting the money that it needs, depending on whether you believe Laurie Hooper or whether you believe the Chief Minister. But several departments of government, I mean, DOI is a great example, DEFA another example, Home Affairs, their departmental budgets have been radically reduced.
And yet the size of government is bigger than it was.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the crude reality.
And I suppose what we're saying is you've cut the budget, you've cut the staffing, but you haven't cut the functions. You haven't said, actually, you know what, we can no longer do that because we simply don't have the staff to do it.
I think you know what I believe is part of the answer, and that is that the formation of the Council of Ministers, however long ago it was now, it must be close to 30 years ago, is it now?
More than that now.
Yeah, it was a step down a road, but it was never finished. And I concluded when I was focused on this issue that we don't actually have a unified government. We have sort of a number of big conglomerate departments that all, as it were, have to stand on their own 2 feet. And that's an expensive process, and therefore we have to find a way of simplifying government or each department and having it able and capable of focusing more on its frontline service deliveries to the people. That doesn't mean there wouldn't be a minister in each department anymore. Of course there would. It wouldn't mean that there wouldn't be a senior, but the senior would be a CEO, a COO, a Chief Operating Officer, instead of a CEO running what is effectively an independent organisation. There'd have to be radical changes to the Attorney General's office, for example, which is now enormous. And in fact, if I take you to the issue, I know I'm jumping down a rabbit hole now, but forgive me. But if you look at the Richard Wright KC report on Rosalind Ranson, he specifically states that his view is that if there had been a unified government and a different relationship with the AG's department and its relationship with each department, it's unlikely that the Rosalind Ranson affair would ever have occurred in the first place. So we're too comfortable, Phil, at the moment with our conglomerate organisation, and if government has to make difficult decisions about how we find a way back to balancing our books without diminishing the services, then there's got to be a new level of trust within the electorate that government is doing its best to sort itself out. And that's what's missing. That's truly missing. People are becoming more and more cynical that the government is there for itself rather than the purpose it exists, which is to serve the people of the Isle of Man.
And of course the difference between the Isle of Man and most democratic systems in the world is that come election time, I'm living in Arbury, Castletown and Malou. I won't get a vote on the government. I've got two members representing me, representing my constituency, and they are not directly part of government. They're certainly not part of Council of Ministers. So a vote against one of those wouldn't necessarily be a vote against government. And likewise, in the north of the island, or in the opposite case, I suppose, north of the island, most of the MHKs are ministers. So I suppose in the north can deliver a clear message to government, but other parts of the island don't get that opportunity.
Well, what you're saying there quite clearly is that to some extent the elector is disenfranchised, and therein lies the problem. How do we keep what is right within our system? That sense of engagement between the individual MHK and the individual constituent, and that still works far better than being an elector in a constituency in the UK with, what is it, I don't know, 50,000 people in it or something. So how do we keep that and yet find a way at the higher level of having the electorate engaged in the discussion about what are the big issues that we all face and how are we going to resolve them, so that the voice of the people comes forward, and the people feel engaged, and inevitably you start focusing on the issue of, well, how do the Swiss do it, with their cantons, where there's even different languages and huge mountains between them, but they do it because the electorate remains engaged in 3 levels of referenda.
Yeah.
And I think seriously we need to be looking at that and finding out, how do we, if we are able to do so, engage the concept of referenda so people feel part of the process and find a way back to that issue of trust, because in the end it's all about trust.
And of course it's finding a way in which you can ask questions that you actually get useful answers, because I've used in a meeting just before we were making this recording, I used the example of the promenade scheme, and I said, if you just went out to the public and said, do you think the promenade scheme has been well handled or not well handled, you'll get a result. I mean, 90%, maybe 99% of the population will say it's been a complete and utter mess. But what are you actually getting out of asking that question? What you actually really need to be saying is, do you think that the way in which we do capital schemes is the best way for delivering a good result? And of course, if people knew, they would, how capital schemes work and what a number of the restrictions and regulations governing capital schemes are put in place for, they'd probably say, this is a mad system. What on earth are you doing?
Well, I would agree. I would agree absolutely that it's a mad system, and the application of big project jobs, multi-million-pound ones, placed within an operating department is a bridge too far for that department, and yet we keep doing it. I mean, I could bore you to death for 25 minutes, half an hour, listing all the projects that have gone wrong and money going astray, and actually, in very simple terms, why that happened. And it was always that the wrong people were commissioned to deliver it unfairly because it was out with their experience. And how on earth have we ended up with a system that pursues its big capital projects in such a clumsy way? And I tried to answer that in 2014 and say, well, we should be doing something else. We should be simplifying our departments, refocusing them on operational delivery, getting the big capital projects centralised so that we didn't have a permanent group of people doing these projects, but we had a team capable of going to find the best people, so that those best people could advise the Council of Ministers in the centre. This is our best assessment of what you need to do. Oh, and by the way, we have checked with the operational departments. And that means that the Council of Ministers as a whole would then be responsible for that. And I, in my time in the Council of Ministers, I too often sat there watching a minister in deep distress over something because he or she was carrying the can for something that in reality that department shouldn't have carried in the first place. And everybody else would sort of...
Gosh, I didn't know you cared after all these years.
Well, I did. Well, of course I did. And I watched all the other members of the Council of Ministers sort of reversing back in their chairs, thinking, well, I'm so glad it's not me. And that's no way to run a government. But that's the system we have. When I'd stepped down from the Council of Ministers, knowing full well that the Council of Ministers didn't want to pursue that route, I felt so guilty about it. I stood again to argue the case for change, and here I am now, 76, still arguing for it. after my time in Parliament in Tynwald. But I think the reason I think I'm continuing is because it's becoming more and more obvious that change needs to be made.
Indeed, it is, because the Treasury Minister is planning to go to Tynwald with a view to removing the triple lock from the pensions. And the idea is that this will save substantial amounts from the National Insurance Fund and potentially unlock some additional reserves for spending on government services while they try and decide how they're going to fix the problem. And I mean, there are various interpretations of what the Treasury Minister is proposing, but certainly removing the triple lock from the pensions is to ease the pressure on the National Insurance Fund.
Fine, but if that argument that you've just placed before me is the correct understanding of what's proposed, then how on earth does that protect my children's and my grandchildren's pensions? And the answer is it doesn't, does it? It's perhaps using funds redirected where actually you should be protecting the NI fund for future pensions, but delivering a much more cost-effective organisation that's consuming taxpayers' monies. So I'd be very anxious about that.
Because, of course, the thing we have to, well, I'm guessing people ought to do is the comparison with other parts, certainly of Europe. Now, the UK, we compare well with the UK because we largely mirror the UK with a few add-ons. But the UK, the pensions paid in the UK are substantially lower than most of the rest of Europe.
Indeed. And where will we be if we don't protect our NI fund for future generations? I mean, appalling thought as an older person that we older ones are consuming the pension fund to the detriment of those who follow, simply because government isn't doing its job and becoming a much slimmer, a more efficient, more productive organisation. I mean, but no doubt pensioners would take the blame for that, and government would sail on, but they would sail on in an atmosphere of some considerable anger, I guess, towards their misconduct. They really must get a grip of this issue about how we run a government that we're able to pay for. As I say, towards the beginning of this conversation, I was talking about where we were in 1969 when I first started work, and the significant number of the MHKs then had come into politics later in life with the cuts and bruises of their life's experiences and the mistakes they'd made, and were delivering their best efforts for a nation, the Manx nation, that was desperately short of money and struggling to find ways forward. And it was supported by a much smaller civil service with long experience and, again, exactly the same heart and determination to get things right. And they did a good job. But actually, over the years, we've got softer and softer. Easy money's allowed government to get bigger, more distracted from the key issues. And now, we're now coming back to first principles that we're not living within our means, and how do we do it?
And sadly, we will have to come back to this because we've got a couple of minutes left.
Right.
But I suppose just a quick summary. Do you actually think that the no confidence vote achieved anything?
Well, it certainly has us trying to address the root issues, and if that's what it's done, if others start focusing on this, as I hope they are, where on earth are we going and what do we think we're doing here, then I hope it helps at least.
But do you think it will?
I think it's got to get worse before it gets better, sadly.
And I suppose a final question then, in terms of the getting that political mandate that we were discussing earlier, which clearly isn't delivered. What you do is you elect 24 MHKs and then they decide what the policies are going to be and how we're going to move forward. Nobody, as far as I'm aware, said we'll have a target population of 100,000 in their manifestos. Would a directly elected Chief Minister help?
I think I'm on record saying recently that up to recent days, I would have said, oh no, that's a step too far. But I'm now so concerned about the issue of how to get a focus between the electorate and the government as to where we're going and why. I think it's something we have to put in the frame to seriously consider.
That was former MHK for Douglas East, Chris Robertshaw. So what do you think? Was the debate and vote on the Chief Minister a pointless navel-gazing exercise, or perhaps you think Alf Cannon really is the problem? Is Chris Robertshaw right in thinking the need for change is urgent? Is the Council of Ministers up to delivering the bold vision that Mr. Robertshaw suggests? Indeed, if you think the current government isn't good enough, would you be willing to put your name forward in the 2026 general election? Let me know your thoughts on the programme by contacting Phil Gaughan at manxradio.com and get in touch if you have any ideas for future shows. Don't forget this programme is available as a podcast on Manx Radio's website. For now, though, I'm Phil Gaughan. Goramayo. Thanks for listening.